Welcome to Comply or Die, the security, compliance, and regulation podcast powered by OpenSense, where you'll learn to embrace a mindset that prioritizes privacy, trust, reputation, and choice with a single goal: to thrive, not just survive, in today's connected world. Let's dive in.
Hey, everybody, this is Alan Wilemon, co-host of Comply or Die podcast, and I am so excited to welcome another VIP guest, Kristina Podnar. She is a digital policy expert, advisor, podcast host of her own, author of The Power of Digital Policy, which I have right here. It's usually just sitting behind me on the bookshelf, so it's easy to just grab it. You may have also seen her give a really cool TEDx talk on revolutionizing how we approach inclusion in the digital age. She is all over digital everything. So it's really cool to welcome Kristina today. Kristina, welcome.
Thanks so much, Alan. It's really great to be here. Appreciate it. And feeling a little bit self-conscious, I guess it is, with that intro, but much appreciated.
Oh, definitely earned it. There's probably like 4 or 5 other really cool things I could have added on. You could have really flexed on everyone, but I tried to limit it just to a few things. Kristina, just to kick off, I would love to, before we get into some of the things you've been working on and your insights on stuff, walk us through your career path a little bit. How did you get to where you are now, what you're doing with all the things that you are doing?
Oh gosh, well, I can tell you honestly, Alan, that I stumbled into my career, and that's probably true for a lot of people who are as old as I am and been around the block a few times. But I actually had a degree in international business. I was going to focus on Asia Pacific, and instead I moved to the Washington, D.C. area, met my husband, and ended up working in the .com space. And what was interesting to me at that time is we did lots of crazy things. I think back then I single-handedly brought down the St. Jude website for like 8 hours. And I had the honor of passing a lot of donations for nonprofits without any kind of encryption to banks via FTP, because those were the crazy things we did at the time. And so I got my start in that space and realized pretty soon that we were doing some crazy things because we could. But a few years in, we shouldn't be doing crazy anymore. And that's how really my love of digital policy and digital governance got started, where I realized we need to stop doing crazy because large brands depend on people doing predictable things in a way that balances out risk and opportunity and doesn't put them at unnecessary risk. And so from there, it was all downhill.
I love it. This is why you're such a great guest too, because stop doing crazy is such a succinct way. It's like a great mission statement for, a lot of the concepts and things that we talked about. Digital policy, going to go back, and that's, a term you use in your book, The Power of Digital Policy. That is my perception. Tell me if I'm wrong here. Digital policy 5 years ago compared to now could be vastly different. Even 10 years ago, every little 5-year chunk, maybe even unrecognizable. How have you seen digital policy, or the need for it, or how it works, or what people are trying to do with it, however you want to answer? How have you seen that evolve over the last 5 years, maybe?
And it's a great question. So first of all, I think a misnomer for folks is that when we're talking about digital policy, we're talking about government regulations or laws. And I really see digital policy, especially inside of organizations, as just a paradigm. It's a paradigm to help us manage and balance out the risks and opportunities that any type of technology or digital brings with it, right? So whatever we're doing, we're usually doing to either help ourselves in some way or to realize the business goal. And in the process of doing that, we can unnecessarily create risk. And so to me, it's all about doing really cool things, innovating, creating, and doing it in a way that is predictable in some sense and doesn't place an organization or an individual at risk, whether that's legal or regulatory or reputational or in other ways. And so the way that I've really seen the space evolve over the last 5 years is, as you mentioned, I wrote this book. It came out in 2019. It felt like it was cricket chirps at the time. Lots of folks in the EU recognized it as a thing, mostly clients I'd been working with. But in the US, there wasn't such a demand for digital policy inside of enterprises. It was very much looked at as something that happened on Capitol Hill. And here we are, fast forward to 24. And one of the things that everybody is clamoring for really is digital policy. And coming to recognize digital policy as something that no longer happens within the four corners of legal or regulatory realms, but really something that all enterprises, small, large, nonprofit or profit, need to actually adopt, because it's a way to exploit and use for good the technologies and the digital capacities that we have, and make sure at the same time that you're managing your reputation in the right way, you're resonating with your end users, your consumers, you're building loyalty, you're building trust, and you're achieving the type of outcomes that you're actually wanting to achieve. So yeah, definitely a lot of fast forwarding in the last 5 years, and I anticipate we're going to only pick up speed as we get into even deeper and more interesting uses of AI and emerging technologies.
Well, I said a lot there. I'm like, which thing do I want to dive into more first? Let me let's go back to where you started, and I think I can bring us back to something I think I thought of. You just started kind of talking about the misconception, I guess, about digital policy, that it's a legal matter. It's solely a legal matter. Maybe that's a better way to say it. And I think you're absolutely right. I think about people that I talk to kind of in the risk space, whether they're compliance professionals, privacy pros, some other types of risk professionals. And you hear that a lot. The people they're interacting with, they're just like, well, what law are we breaking? And if we're not breaking one completely, like definitively breaking it, then like, who cares? But kind of what you're bringing out there, the other risks that exist. Not only do they exist, but maybe are even bigger risks, possibly, right? From maybe just from a likelihood standpoint than a legal risk, depending what we're talking about. How do you? It sounds like you've had success changing that mindset somewhat to get people out of like it's only legal, it's only regulatory. But do you have tips for others who are kind of floundering or trying to get people to see that? How do you get people to believe there's more than just legal risk when we're talking about digital or AI or these other things?
Well, usually the way that I explain it, especially when we're talking with folks who are at the C-suite level, is I always talk about risk in a good way, right? So if none of us wanted risk, we wouldn't get up in the morning. We probably wouldn't leave our house. We wouldn't plug in our machines into the wall or connect them to a Wi-Fi. We would probably only eat the things that we could grow ourselves. We wouldn't take on any type of risk. But risk is good. And what we want to do is be really smart about what risk we're taking on and understanding that risk. It's okay to take on risk. You want to, because it's competitive in a way, right? You can actually be in the marketplace, you can compete, you can innovate, you can get ahead of others. So risk isn't bad. What's bad is not understanding that risk and being surprised by that risk. And so that's a context in which I talk to most people about digital policy and about risk, and really helping them move beyond just the laws and the regulations, but also stopping to think about it as just something where we have to have bureaucracy and compliance. Because in my mind, when you actually have that freedom, right, within the framework, which we always talk about, if you have a framework, you understand your bounds, you know where the limits are, how far, how fast you can push, then you can have that freedom to innovate. You can have the freedom to create. You can do some really cool things, and you can balance out those risks and opportunities. So it really comes down to understanding the space that you're playing in. And a lot of people say, well, risk is really bad. Well, I don't know that it is. If you're a startup and you're trying to get it, get your idea out to the marketplace, then you are inherently probably trying to take on some risk, because otherwise you're not going to have innovation. You're not going to be disrupting the marketplace. You're not going to be doing something cool and innovative and different. So you're inherently taking on a risk. And that's really a good time to assess what type of risk it is that you're willing to take on. A lot of times I hear from folks like, well, I have a startup and all I'm looking to do is set up my great idea and get out. I want to sell out. That's cool. Take on risk. Just understand that you're taking on potentially the type of risk that's going to devalue your company someday, right? Because venture capitalists or anybody who's looking to acquire you, it's probably going to acquire your company if you're doing something really cool, but they're not going to pay you a full dollar's worth, right? For your worth.
Right.
They're going to say, hey, there's some risk here, or I don't know if it's legal or if it's regulatory, it might not be. It might just be reputational. There's a risk here, but you have something really cool. I'll pay you 60 cents on the dollar. That's what you're going to get paid. So it could be something as simple as that, all the way to really large corporations that are very much looking to protect the brand that they've built over the last several hundred years. And I think understanding that that goes beyond just what's written legally to the fact that you can end up on the front page of the Wall Street Journal is a thing.
Wow. I love that. And you're speaking about risk in I still think it's such a different way to, you're correct. And I think everyone intrinsically like believes that, but to say it out loud that like, well, risk is good, that's still it's so hard. I bet a lot of people will just like get close to that, but can't quite say it. I mean, what's the biggest pushback you get when you take this very kind of risk, I don't say risk friendly, but just like risk, unafraid of risk or risk embracing? Maybe that's a better way to say it. when you come in with that mindset and approach, what's the biggest pushback you're finding with that?
A lot of times what you actually see is pushback from the legal or the regulatory, the compliance teams. They're like, no, we don't want to have risk. We want to push back. We don't want any risk whatsoever. And I always say, well, you know what? Gosh, you should really unplug everything from the wall as quickly as possible, disconnect the Wi-Fi, and you will be 100% protected. You will be as safe as I can guarantee you, or anybody else can as well, which is true, right? I mean, we can't do that. We cannot operate in a digital world anymore. We're heading into a new year soon. And the reality is that, we have to be involved in technology and digital in some ways. And so at the end of the day, if you don't want to take on any risk, turn everything off. If you want to take on some risk, you have to operate in this world. And then the question becomes, how much risk is tolerable for you, which varies by industry, obviously. If you're in a heavily regulated arena, there's certain things you're just not going to compromise on. But there are many things that you are willing to compromise on, or that you're willing to actually trade off the benefit for the risk. And to me, that's the informed conversation that everybody needs to be having. And folks tend to embrace that once they start understanding that it's not a free for all. It's not a crazy dance. It's actually something where we understand what we're doing, how we're doing it. But what we're doing is mindfully freeing up organizations and the people who work there to embrace creativity, to embrace freedom, to actually understand that they can innovate in a way that doesn't put the organization at risk and deliver value at the same time. But yeah, you're right. It's absolutely a conversation. It's an educational process because we've been taught intrinsically to resist risk. And it's not a good paradigm for the era that we live in.
Mm. You use the term mindful, or the concept of mindfulness there. I'd love to jump on that, because everybody knows at this point, it's been an entire year of nothing but AI. AI is everything. It's the only topic. It's the only business vertical to invest in. It's what everybody's focused on right now. But and it's cool. There's a lot of really cool stuff. There's a ton of opportunity. I won't downplay that at all. But I feel like mindfulness is a key, is a helpful thing to bring to that discussion, because there's a lot of hype about any types of these new and shiny and fancy, and it has endless possibilities. So we think there's hype and then there's actual value, and we're always sifting, and being mindful and kind of the way we're evaluating things is super helpful. So have you used some proven methods to kind of bring mindfulness into AI discussions as the groups you're working with are like, we're bringing on this tool, or we're launching this, we're selling this solution, the whole budget's behind this. How do you use mindfulness to take a beat, to take a breath, and see what's value and what's hype?
Yeah, well, I think you're spot on, first of all, in terms of, right now we're all about AI. 18 months ago, it was all about the metaverse. I don't know if you remember those headlines or not, but it was all about immersive technologies. And so these are natural cycles that we go through. And I think it's only human to get really excited about what they can do and to try and understand, how can you leverage it? How can you exploit it for really good business outcomes? So I think that that's a fair thing to focus on and a fair thing to try and chase. What I continually try to do is talk about how much of this is innovation versus how much of it is mainstream. So it's very natural for organizations to dabble and to really try to assess, does this thing have some business legs underneath it? Is it going to go anywhere? And so innovation, creativity is all fun. You should be doing that. You should be playing with AI. But I come back to this entire notion of mindfulness, which is at a point where you start to understand that something actually has legs, it's going to take off in the enterprise, it's going to be used for an actual business need, you need to start to govern. You need to define your policies, and you need to understand that framework. Otherwise, that's where you really start to take on that risk that you inadvertently are taking on. It's not mindful risk that you want to actually step into. And so it's creating that framework. And the way that I found it's easiest to really start to create awareness of that, or really try and get organizations to be mindful, is to really delegate authority for that risk opportunity balance to what I call in my book, the digital policy steward. But it can be a central figure. It can be a committee, an AI committee, if you will, within a lot of organizations right now. The goal being that, we want to play, we want to understand these things. We want to understand what goes into executing against them versus being ready to execute against them. And right now, most people are just jumping into like, hey, let's do, some type of chat GPT, or should we do BAR, right? Like that's the conversation. Nobody's asking, are we actually ready to take on these technologies? How do we trust them? How do we actually ask our customers to trust that whatever the product or service is that's coming outside of these tools? And so that's where we really need to be mindful about the process, that risk opportunity balance that I talk about, and really kind of back the bus up a little bit and start talking about like, hey, before we get to that bus stop collectively together or our destination that we're so excited about, what is that journey going to look like? Let's kind of think about what does readiness really look like, as a colleague of mine likes to say. Do we have the right people in charge of the right things? Do we understand our inputs? For AI, that's data, for example. And you mentioned earlier in our conversation, I think before we started this podcast, the data provenance standards I've been involved with at the Data and Trust Alliance. Great example of really thinking about this further upstream, thinking about everything before you get to that destination, because it's that entire journey, it's that entire process that's going to create either the risk or the opportunity. And that's where you can tip the scales in your own favor.
Well, I'm really glad you brought that up, because definitely is like on my list of things to talk about. Can we talk about that for a minute? Let's talk about, I mean, what you've been doing with data provenance, and maybe even, for some people listening, explain what you mean by that kind of quickly. Because provenance, we use that not that often to begin with, but when we use it kind of in other ways. We use it with antiquities, and we use it with other things. So talk to us about what that is and what you've been doing with that, Christine.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's funny that you say, we don't use the word providence. And then my mind immediately went to like the spinach, recall outbreak and the latest cantaloupe. I heard there was like, I guess, a cantaloupe recall or something recently. And so every time that we have this like salmonella outbreak in the food supply chain, we go, provenance, where did this stuff come from? Oh, it's from this farm. Don't take anything in that's from this farm, or don't eat the spinach from this place. It's the same thing really with our data. Right now, what's happening is we live in an interesting data ecosystem where with large organizations procuring data from third parties, or maybe even businesses and business units treating data internally to their enterprise, we don't actually know what it is that we're getting. We're getting these data sets. Wonderful. We can use data for AI. A lot of that data is actually going into the generative AI space, and it's going to have an impact very long term. And what's happening is we really don't know what it is that we're taking on, right? It's almost like an unknown blob. It's a data set. And so for us at the Data and Trust Alliance, what we've been focusing on is how do we start to build trust into AI and trust into the data that fuels AI. And this alliance is interesting because it actually has some of the well-established brands out there that have bandied into the alliance with the only KPI being adoption, right? So build reliable tools, adopt them, make sure that we build trust in the data, trust in AI that's coming at us. And it's really the next cornerstone of business. And so we've been playing for less than months, as you just mentioned, with these standards. And the standards themselves are intended to give us almost like a boot label equivalent for data. It's really understanding what's inside of a data set before you decide to use it. It could be a situation maybe where you are looking to procure data from a third party and you want to understand how trustworthy is that data. Right now, most organizations don't understand that. They have no sense. They're going to get data from either an ad tech, MarTech context, or they're going to get it from a third party. They're hoping for the best. They think it's the kind of data they want to use. But we know from studies like the McKinsey study that came out that over 40% of a data scientist's time is spent pre-processing data or cleaning up data that's going to be used in AI, which is ridiculous. Think about that. Like that's over 40% of somebody's day. Half of your day almost is spent cleaning data before you can use it. At mass scale, that's just ridiculous. And so the idea is if you can get visibility into where this data is coming from, how trustworthy is it for your use case, right? That's something that can then fuel your business because you can understand, is this data fit for my purpose? Does it fit my use case scenarios? Does it not? It's almost like a sniff test, if you will, to understand, is this good enough to use and ingest into the enterprise or not? And so the standards themselves, there's 8 of them, and they consist of a metadata unique ID, Provenance metadata unique ID that's actually sitting on top of each metadata set. And then within the standard set, there are things like the lineage standard, the source standard, which people kind of go like, lineage, source, that's not that exciting. I don't know. I kind of think lineage is cool. Trying to understand where your data came from is a cool thing. Did people consent to having their data collected? Did they not? How many sources of data have been merged together into a single source? That's stuff that I personally want to know. But then the standards themselves go beyond that, which I think is really cool. We actually included things like legal rights, privacy protection into the standard set, as well as your typical generation date. as well as things like your data type standard, which is all about, is the data structured, unstructured, semi-structured, which tells you or gives you an indicator, if you will, of potentially how much cleanup you might have to do. There's also the generation method standard and the intended use and restriction standard. Now, some of these might sound familiar to folks listening because they appear in other standard sets, things like the W4, W3C. They have aspects or elements of these standards. But things like your legal rights, your privacy, your intended use, for example, and restrictions, those are unique to the standard set. And so for the first time, we're looking not just at standards, but we're looking at cross-industry standards. So these standards will apply to every industry, the cross-industry standards, and they will be used by some of the largest producers and consumers and buyers of data in our ecosystem, which means that we're looking to not just impact data provenance, so you can understand where data comes from, where it's flowing, but also, can you trust that data? Should you not trust that data, more importantly? And I think ultimately change the landscape of the data ecosystem by positively impacting data quality, which is something that we've been struggling with in the data space for decades.
Right on. I really appreciate you talking through those standards. And it's pretty complex. Like some of that's kind of heavy and it's detailed. But there's value, I think, in showing, how detailed it is and how precise of a science, to use that term, it can be. On a recent episode of your podcast, we were talking with your guest about trust and AI. And someone made the comment that, like, yeah, when you say like transparency, fairness, you say all the things, safety, you say that quickly enough, it just sounds really simple. And that's usually when we talk about trust, like, oh, it's safe, it's transparent, it's fair, but then you look at what it actually takes to be fair and to be transparent and to be reliable and have good integrity. And it is a lot of work. Those are not just buzzwords that we kind of throw at our tools and say, oh yeah, they're all these things. You know these things. Say the words. The word safe. It takes a lot of work.
It does.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting about everything that you just said is I completely agree with you. But the thing that's still missing from that description is the fundamental question around things like even as simple and basic as copyrights. Do I actually own this data or not? Right. So if you're going to do something with AI and you have a data set in front of you, people say, well, you can't copyright data. Well, actually, you can copyright a data set. So yes, there actually is a copyright potentially that goes along with this. And it doesn't have to be a copyright. It can be attribution, right? Maybe, Alan, you did a lot of work on a data set and you don't want to copyright it. You want it to roam the world and be available for society on the whole. But perhaps I should attribute back to you and give you some credit for the fact that you spent all this time and effort curating or creating this data set. That's a thing. And so for me as an enterprise, before I even take on any data, what I ought to be thinking about are things like, can I even own the copyright? Can I legally own whatever product comes out of the AI using that data? And what's interesting is right now we're missing that, which is why I start to see these conversations around really big Gen AI systems, a lot of the foundational models that are coming out, because what they're doing is they're scraping a lot of the internet data. They're taking people's copyrighted information and they're dumping them into AI in a way that we can't reverse that back out of the muffin. I say the blueberries are the muffin. Too bad if you didn't want the blueberry muffin. It's already baked in, right? Same thing here. So you really want to go in eyes wide open to, yes, making sure that we can trust, making sure that there's ethics, making sure that we're addressing bias, but also fundamentally that you're addressing the legal and the regulatory aspects, because yes, it'll be a legal thing, but it'll be a bigger issue when you get into things like your brand and your reputation, if you actually took somebody's copyrighted materials and used it without their permission.
Love it. I love the food analogies. I love the blueberries being in the muffins. I love the nutrition label you mentioned earlier. I think you maybe have invented this concept of like data salmonella that we will give you
Oh
if that exists.
Oh no. Oh, that's horrible. I don't want to be known for that.
It's a terrible term, but it's scary enough that like it gives the real perspective, right? Because you just closed your comment talking about, reputational risk again. And maybe we've seen it so far. I don't know that we've seen a large scale case where the public has kind of pushed back hard on kind of data quality or data provenance or unfairness of data in some sets. Maybe we have it. I'm just not thinking of it. But I imagine that tipping point is coming at some point as people continue to race forward and ignore some of the things they should not be ignoring. So, how do you see that potentially playing out where, reputation really, bites a group for not taking into account some of these important things?
Yeah, so we're already seeing lawsuits, by the way, right? Coming around the fact that data has been ingested, copyrighted data has been ingested
Oh, true.
into
Yeah.
large language models, right? So we're not seeing the public so much maybe push back and say, hey, what type of data do you have? Is it good data, bad data? We need data provenance. We're not hearing those words. What we're seeing are lawsuits coming out at the other end saying, hey, use my data. That was actually copyrighted. Like I had a little copyright logo on my website and you still scraped my website and took the data and trained your LLM on my data. So I want my data back. I don't want you using it. So that's sort of interesting because the lawsuits are actually on the rise. But I think above and beyond that, there's a lot of questions around how are these large language models learning? For example, I was talking to a colleague today and I said, oh, we should write an article. This lesson learned. It would be so great to share this with the world. And he was like, no, because all that is going to do is get published, right? There's going to be a crawler that ingests this into, a Jet AI, and it's going to be available for the world, within 6 months. And that's my proprietary information in my head. I don't want that escaping. And I was like, that's interesting. So I think that for folks, there's actually this starting kind of increasing awareness point that it can't be the wild, wild west. There has to be some kind of norm, some types of rules that we all agree to respect. And I think for me, at least, I feel like we're almost in the early days of the web when I did like the crazy dance. And now we're doing a little bit of that crazy dance. And what I'm trying to say and what we're trying to do at the data and provenance level is be able to say, you know what? It doesn't have to be crazy. Before it gets crazy, we can select our music. We can head onto the dance floor. We can all know what we're going to be playing to. And we can still have a really great time like we do on a regular dance floor. Even if we have these rules in place, it's okay. We can do that.
Great analogy. And it's such an interesting, story with your colleague there. I feel like at times people talk about, oh, doing things compliantly or even just measuredly, that stifles innovation. We can't do that. We just innovate. I think that's a misnomer, or misnomer is the wrong term. That's the wrong mindset. But kind of in that example that you gave, here's somebody that's super smart and could be doing something, and in some ways is hesitant to get out there and produce something because of how it's going to be used, how it's going to be taken, stolen maybe is a better term. And so you see in some ways kind of the lack of standards is kind of harming innovation, right? Because people are not wanting to go out there because they don't want their stuff stolen, or they don't want their stuff misattributed or misused at whatever, it might be done with whatever they might be creating. So I think that's a really interesting story, something I had not considered before.
I mean, what's interesting about that is you just caused me to kind of think back to the opening in my book that Mike Elgin wrote. And his fundamental question was, would you ever get on an airplane and take a trip if you knew that the pilot didn't actually double check the safety of the plane, that it was in good working order, proper order before it took off? And the answer is, of course you wouldn't, right? I mean, I certainly wouldn't. I don't know anybody in their right mind who would, unless maybe, I don't know, their brother or father or something was the pilot and they somehow had an extra level of trust. But I think it's the same thing here. I think that when we talk about AI, we're still talking about AI in very generic terms. We're not talking about the AIs that are going to become such fundamental components of society fabric that they're going to really take over a lot of things for us, right? For right now, if you're using some AI in MarTech, maybe it's okay. Maybe I feel comfortable with that. Right now, Outlook is kind of using some AI to help me maybe like predefine the, topic of my email, or maybe finish my sentence for me as I'm typing. That still seems okay. But when the AI of the world starts to take over things that are fundamentally everyday involved, like I don't actually get to control how my car drives anymore. I don't actually get to decide, what's going to be in my food for my child, et cetera. I want to know that I can fundamentally trust those systems at a human level. That's where I need my checklist. And we're definitely at the very early stages of that. And so I think for organizations that can develop those checklists, that understand how to produce that safety for people, that's where they're going to have the competitive edge. And that's where we talk about that risk and opportunity in real life terms and say, yes, this is the moment for enterprises to take that opportunity and say, I am going to resonate in the marketplace and do it in such a tangible way that you say, yes, I will have that checklist. I will be your safety net. Get on my plane, take a ride, 100% guaranteed. I'll get you to your destination safely, soundly. And you're going to enjoy vacation when you get there. Isn't that what we all want?
I love it. Kristina, I've got two more questions for you. And I'm going to toss at you here before we wrap up here. The first one is, we've already established that you are a leader in the space. I mean, you are in the room with companies that are working in this. You are leading discussions with others about this. You are writing about this. You are doing all the things about this stuff. Let's think about people that are brand new to this world, whether specifically to AI or just some other form of digital policy, come in different forms. What kind of wisdom would you give to somebody that's just getting into this and it's all moving 1,000 miles an hour and it seems wild and crazy? And what would you say to someone kind of in that area, in that situation?
So I think one of the things that I was told very early on in my career not to do, I actually did. And so this is my one piece of advice I have to everybody out there, which is I was told to not be a generalist. I was told to specialize, because when I started my career eons ago, it was all about specializing in an area, right? Like, you were the best Java developer. You were the best, I don't know, server, software maintainer, whatever it is, right? Specialize, specialize, specialize. I found that being more of a generalist, or being more open to general ideas and trying out different things, was more helpful. Because when we start talking about digital policy and balancing out risk and opportunities, you need to actually understand what the array is. You actually have to understand that making a decision in one space impacts something else. By saying yes to something, you're saying no to the other thing. And that's really the benefit of having a digital policy steward, having a digital policy consultant, having a digital policy advisor, is that you can actually understand the entire array, the ecosystem within which you're operating, and be able to understand that if you make a decision about one thing, it's going to impact another area. And that really is what sound digital policy is. Because if you say, look, here's the stance we're going to take, for example, on privacy, that's great. But if this is the stance we take on privacy, here are the other things that we will either limit, or the opportunity doors that we will open. And it's the ability to take and tie those components together and present that picture that really makes you a valuable individual. And that's something that gets you ahead, whether it's in your career or just in, I think, your personal desires from a, I want to expand my intellectual space perspective.
Great thought. Appreciate that. All right. Last question, short one. What one word would you use to describe the future of digital policy? And then I'll let you explain why you give me that one word. So what word describes the future of digital policy to you, Kristina?
The word that came immediately to mind was bright. I'm not sure if that's because I need some light bulbs replaced in my office, or because I really think it's bright. But I think it is bright for digital policy, because until now, it feels like we've been in a little bit of a sleepwalk from this understanding that, yes, there's risk and opportunities, or the blunders that we actually made were so small, right? Not having the up-to-date copyright on your website doesn't make you look that great. Not the end of the world unless you're going to court. I think the stakes are so much higher. They're higher not just for AI, they're higher for all of the technologies that are coming after AI. And that's a good thing to understand. You said this earlier, I think, Alan, which is we're so heavily focused right now on AI. 18 months ago, it was all about extended reality, virtual reality, augmented reality. We're going to make that circle come back to a starting point. It will be there again, whether it's, metaverses or it's the next new thing. And what we really need is that risk opportunity ruler, measurement, and the ability to unleash that creativity. And in that process, the only thing that I can think of is digital policy. And so it's going to shine, brighter and brighter. And I think this is a great opportunity, right? It's an opportunity for every lawyer out there to become savvy in technologies that are coming at us. For every compliance person, it's an opportunity to understand how to balance out the risk and opportunities. So in my mind, very optimistic. The future is very bright.
Great answer. Thanks for being a good sport on that. And thanks for all the insight you gave us today, Kristina. Really cool talking with you. I really appreciate your time.
Thanks so much for having me. This was actually a lot of fun.
Absolutely. And for those listening, that's a wrap on another episode of Comply or Die. We hope you enjoyed our conversation with Kristina Podnar. To people listening, remember, compliance is not just a necessity, it is the key to your sustainable and profitable future. If you liked this episode, found it valuable, please subscribe, leave a review. Your feedback keeps the whole thing going. Stay compliant, stay informed, stay tuned for the next episode of Comply or Die. Until then, this is Alan Wilemon signing off. Thanks for listening, everybody.
You've tuned in to the Comply or Die podcast. If you found this episode informative, we would appreciate it if you could take a moment to give us a 5-star rating. It helps us reach a wider audience and spread the knowledge. Don't forget to share the podcast with your friends or colleagues who could benefit from these insights. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll hope you'll join us again for our next episode. Until next time, stay informed, stay compliant, and stay in business.